This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nitsahone, and today is Friday, and that means it's time for another MTG Top 10, the series where I rank cards based on their historical performance at Magic's highest level of competition. Today, we're going to take a look at Sagas. Saga is an enchantment subtype that was originally introduced in 2018's Dominaria. These enchantments come with chapters, and when they enter the battlefield, they start with a lore counter and give you the Chapter 1 effect. Then, during your draw step every turn, you add a lore counter and get the next effect. Once you resolve the third chapter, the saga goes to your graveyard in most cases. Sagas generally end up giving you a great deal for the amount of mana you spend and are balanced by the fact that you have to wait for the card to give you all of its effects. Many of them also have really great art modeled after real-world artistic styles throughout world history, something I personally really enjoy about them. Sagas were an instant hit in terms of both flavor and gameplay and quickly became a deciduous mechanic, meaning we see them every few sets. For example, among standard legal sets right now, we had Sagas in Kamigawa Neon Dynasty, Dominaria United, and March of the Machine. This is actually the second time I've looked at Sagas. I also did a top 10 on them 2 years ago in episode 365 of this series, but like I've just discussed, we've seen a lot more Sagas over the last few years, and the list has already changed significantly, so it's time for an update. To be eligible for this list, a card simply had to have the Saga subtype. In all, there were 88 cards eligible, and in this video we'll look at the 10 that have left the biggest impact on competitive Magic, and as usual in update lists, we'll also look at the cards that were on the list last time but didn't make it this time. Before we get started, here's a quick reminder on how I score cards in these videos. A first tier top 8 is worth 2 points, this includes events like Pro Tours, and a second tier top 8 is worth 1 point, this includes events like regional championships. Alright, let's start with a look at the 5 cards that made the 2021 list, but aren't on it this time, starting with Timorette Calls the Dead, which was at number 10 last time. This 3-mana saga mills 3 cards with Chapter 1 and 2, and then if you have a creature or enchantment in your graveyard, you can exile it to get a 2/2. Then Chapter 3 gains you X life and you scry X, where X is equal to the number of zombies you control. So this saga does a nice job of loading your graveyard and paying you off for it. While in Standard, it was played in some Rakdos aggro decks that utilized escape creatures like Kroxa and Woe Strider. Last time around, 4 points was enough to make the list, but this time, it took 27. Timorette Calls the Dead hasn't built on its score at all over the last 2 years, so it's nowhere close to making the list, and that's very unlikely to change. Next, it is the Flame of Keld, which was at number 9 last time. This 2-mana saga has you discard your hand with Chapter 1, you draw 2 cards with Chapter 2, and then Chapter 3 augments your red sources of damage for a turn, making them all do 2 additional damage. Obviously, this is a nice saga for red aggro decks because it helps you reload your hand, and then allows you to do a ton of damage in a single turn. Unsurprisingly, that's exactly the kind of deck that played it while it was in Standard. It also sees a bit of play in modern red deck wins, and so far has a single point in the format, and that's the 1 point it has gained since 2021. While it may gain some more points, it has a very long way to go to find itself back on the list. Next, it is Kiora Beth the Sea God, which was at number 8 last time. In a vacuum, this saga is arguably the most powerful one in the entire game, assuming we disregard its mana cost. However, it does cost 7 mana, which is a hefty amount in many formats, but it does really deliver on that investment. Chapter 1 gives you an 8/8 hexproof Kraken, Chapter 2 taps all of your opponent's non-land permanents, and they don't untap until your opponent's next untap step, and Chapter 3 lets you steal and untap an opposing permanent. Those effects are all quite powerful individually, so paying 7 mana for all of it is pretty amazing. Kiora Beth the Sea God gained all of its points in Standard, almost entirely in a single deck, Yorion Ultimatum. It combos quite well with both Yorion and Emergent Ultimatum. Yorion can potentially reset it to Chapter 1 in situations where another Kraken suits you, and it also makes for a really great card to search up when you cast Emergent Ultimatum. While it has gained 16 points since 2021, it fell 5 points short of the threshold to make the list, and it doesn't have any points since rotating out of Standard, so it may never get there. Next, it is Birth of Meletis, which was at number 5 last time. This 2-mana saga lets you search up a plains with Chapter 1, creates a 0/4 wall with Chapter 2, and gains you 2 life with Chapter 3. Those are all pretty small things individually, but that's a ton of value for such a low investment. It's basically a slow burn version of Wall of Omens that has a bit more upside. In Standard, it was played in the Yorion deck we already discussed. Lots of Sagas go great with that powerful companion. Additionally, it was played in Standard, Control, and Fires of Invention decks. It works really well in both of those because both really need their early land drops and they need some help to get to the point where they can take over the game, and Birth accomplishes those things for them. It's also been played in Pioneer Fires of Invention, and it's gained 3 points since 2021, but it doesn't have any points at all since 2022, so it isn't super likely that it'll find its way back on the list. And last, there's the Oldest Reborn, which had the most precipitous drop, falling off of the list after coming in at number 3 2 years ago. This 5-mana saga makes your opponent sacrifice a creature with Chapter 1, makes them discard with Chapter 2, and Chapter 3 lets you reanimate a creature or planeswalker from any graveyard. In the end, you get an impressive 3-for-1 from the Eldest Reborn. It gained all of its points in Standard, where it was played in the sideboard of aggro decks to bring in against opponents who could make the game go long, while also appearing in the main deck of mini control decks. But it hasn't gained any points outside of Standard, meaning it has 0 points since the 2021 list, and like all the rest of the sagas that aren't on the list anymore, it's probably never going to find its way back. So those are the 5 cards that fell off of the list. Let's move now to the list proper, with our number 10 card, Showdown of the Scalds, which wasn't on the list at all last time, as it only had 3 points, partly because it had just recently been printed. Chapter 1 exiles the top 4 cards of your library, and you can play those cards until the end of your next turn. Chapters 2 and 3 allow you to put a +1/+1 counter on a creature you control every time you cast a spell. Obviously, Chapter 1 helps fuel the Chapter 2 turn, as you have a bunch of extra cards to cast. This often gives you a ton of card advantage while also buffing your board, so it has a huge impact on many games. It's been played in both Standard and Pioneer Boros aggro decks, where it functions as top curve that often gives you what you need to finish off your opponent. Because your curve is so low in those decks, you'll likely be able to cast every single card you reveal. It can be particularly spicy in enchantment-based decks like Naya Runes, because that deck can generate additional value from the fact that it's an enchantment. It looks likely to continue to gain more points in Pioneer going forward. At number 9, it is Espeths Nightmare, which was at number 7 last time. This 3-mana saga destroys a creature with power 2 or less, with Chapter 1. Chapter 2 lets you look at your opponent's hand and make them discard a non-creature, non-land card, and Chapter 3 exiles your opponent's graveyard. This is another fairly cheap saga that can deliver a nice 2-for-1, and it's also great for hating on the graveyard. It is yet another saga that saw play in Standard Yorion decks, though it was also played as a sideboard card in Rakdos aggro. While it has gained 23 points since 2021, it has also since rotated out of Standard and hasn't gained any more points since then. If I revisit this list again in 2 years, there's a good chance it won't still be here. At number 8, it is the restoration of Igonjo, which didn't even exist back in 2021. This is a Kamigawa Neon Dynasty saga, which means it transforms into a creature after Chapter 3. This 3-mana saga searches up a plains with Chapter 1. With Chapter 2, you can discard a card, and if you do, you bring back a tap permanent with mana value 2 or less from your graveyard, and Chapter 3 has you exile it, and it returns to play as Architect of Restoration, a 3/4 with Vigilance that makes 1/1 tokens anytime it attacks or blocks. Yeah, that's an insane amount of value for the investment. Chapter 1 and 3 each give you a full card of value, and Chapter 2 is nice too, since it actually gives you a way to ramp in white, provided you have a land in your graveyard. But it's a nice value ability either way. It's gained almost all of its points in Standard, a format it's still legal in right now. It's largely been featured in control decks that are interested in this kind of slow burn value, with mono-white control its most frequent home. It also sees some play in Modern in both Stoneblade and Enchantress decks. So far it only has a single point in that format, but it is likely to gain some more there in the future, in addition to the fact that it's going to gain more points before it rotates out of Standard. So it is likely to gain some significant additional points in the future. At number 7, it is the History of Benalia, which was at number 2 last time. This 3-mana saga makes a 2/2 Knight token with Vigilance with Chapter 1 and 2, and Chapter 3 gives all of your Knights +2/+1. This is great at helping you quickly go wide, while also giving you a nice bonus effect should you have some additional Knights around. It was pretty heavily played in Standard, appearing in both aggro and control decks, but it hasn't gained any points since rotating, and that has led to it falling all the way to number 7 this time. At number 6, it is Binding the Old Gods, which was at number 4 last time. This 4-mana saga destroys a non-land permanent with Chapter 1, Chapter 2 searches up a forest and puts it into play tapped, and then Chapter 3 gives all of your creatures Death Touch until end of turn. Basically, this lets you destroy most permanents while also ramping your mana. Chapter 3 is usually a throwaway effect, but chapters 1 and 2 deliver enough value that it doesn't really matter. In Standard, it was primarily played in Yorion decks, where it was especially good since chapter 1 is the one you wanted the most anyway. It has also gained points in historic Yorion decks as well, and in Judd midrange decks in the format, as well as Judd midrange decks in Pioneer. It's likely to gain more points in the future. At number 4, it is Hidezugu Consumes All, which didn't even exist in 2021. This 3-mana Kamigawa Neon Dynasty Saga lets you destroy each non-land permanent with mana value 1 or less with Chapter 1, exiles all graveyards with Chapter 2, and Chapter 3 has it transform into Vessel of the All-Consuming, a 3/3 trampler that gets a +1/+1 counter when it does damage, and when it damages a player, if it has dealt 10 or more damage to that player, they lose the game. That last part isn't super easy to do something with, but you do get a nice creature to go with a removal spell that hates on the graveyard, and all for only 3 mana. It hasn't done much in Standard, mostly because Chapter 1 doesn't consistently do something enough, but it's done a ton of work in formats with larger card pools, where decks tend to both be more reliant on the graveyard and more reliant on super cheap permanents. Modern is by far the format where it's made the biggest impact, where you can find at least one copy of it somewhere in the 75 in any deck that is capable of casting it, but it's also done a lot in Historic and even seen some success in Legacy. Its multi-format success means that it likely has more longevity than many of the other sagas we've looked at so far, and there's a good chance that it will move much higher on the list. At number 4, it is Elspeth Conquers Death, which has been dethroned from its number 1 spot. This 5-mana saga exiles a permanent with mana value 3 or greater with Chapter 1. Chapter 2 makes your opponent pay 2 extra mana for their non-creature spells until your next turn, and Chapter 3 lets you reanimate a creature or planeswalker from the graveyard with a +1/+1 counter or loyalty counter on it. This is another saga that can give you as much as a 2-for-1, and it does it all for 5 mana. The fact it exiles with Chapter 1 is important too, as it allowed it to deal with creatures that wouldn't stay dead, like Uro and Woe Strider, creatures it has removed in many formats. It's been played in various control decks, including Yorion decks in Historic, Pioneer, and Standard, as well as in Pioneer Fires of Invention. While it is still gaining points, it isn't doing it at the same rate as Hidezugu Consumes All, so it is likely to lose more ground on the list in the future. At number 3, it's the Acroan War, which was at number 6 last time, which it accomplished by gaining a whopping 45 points over the last 2 years. It's the only card that was on the list back in 2021 that has actually moved up. This 4-mana saga's Chapter 1 lets you gain control of an opposing creature for as long as it remains on the battlefield. Chapter 2 forces your opponent's creatures to attack, and Chapter 3 makes all tapped creatures do damage to themselves equal to their power. Like most sagas, each chapter synergizes quite well with the others. Chapter 1 lets you take your opponent's best creature, Chapter 2 forces your opponent into an attack, which is likely to give you some great blocks, and Chapter 3 kills everything that is tapped, including your opponent's creatures that you just forced to attack you. The war has seen a ton of play in Standard, Explorer, and Pioneer aggro decks where it can really thrive. Chapter 1 can often get rid of a problematic blocker, and Chapter 2 makes sure your opponent won't be able to block effectively on that next turn, making it a nice top curve option to finish your opponent off. It's particularly nice in Gruul Vehicles decks in the format, which can get immediate value out of stealing a creature, since they can use it to crew one of their mini vehicles. The deck also uses the creature they stole to crew a vehicle in response to the Chapter 3 trigger, which means you end up killing the creature you stole from your opponent in the first place. It's going to keep gaining points in the future, but it will probably never catch the top 2 cards on the list, like our number 2 card, Fable of the Mirrorbreaker. A card that didn't even exist back in 2021, so its high spot on the list is particularly impressive. This 3-mana saga's Chapter 1 gives you a 2/2 that makes a treasure when it attacks. Chapter 2 lets you discard up to 2 cards to draw that many cards, and Chapter 3 transforms it into Reflection of Kiki-Jiki, a 2/2 with an activated ability that costs 1 mana, and you tap the Reflection to make a temporary token copy of a non-legendary creature. So in the end, you pay 3 mana for 2 2/2s that have a bunch of upside, and Faithless Looting also happens to be stapled to them. That's insane value, and it has led to the Fable being played in every single one of Magic's formats. It ramps your mana, helps you load the graveyard, lets you add to the board, and can even enable some silly combos once it transforms. Fable is going to continue to gain tons and tons of points, and it even has an outside shot to catch the number 1 card on the list, although right now, that card has a significant lead, and that card is, of course, Erza Saga. This saga is also a land, so it doesn't cost any mana, making it absolutely insane. Chapter 1 allows it to tap for colorless mana, Chapter 2 gives it the ability to churn out constructs that get +1/+1 for each artifact you control, and Chapter 3 lets you tutor up an artifact with a mana value of 0 or 1 and put it directly on the battlefield. So, yeah, not much of a surprise that this is insanely powerful, as it can work just like a normal land, but can add to the board with Chapters 2 and 3. It was printed in Modern Horizons 2, so the only 60 card formats it's legal in are Modern, Legacy, and Vintage, but it has quickly become a key card in all 3 formats. Each of these formats already had powerful artifact decks before Erza Saga, and the Saga slotted right into those decks and made them much, much better. Those decks also all really have great cheap artifacts to tutor up, and can make the construct tokens absolutely massive. Erza Saga, barring a ban, is fairly likely to hold on to its #1 spot on the list. Fable is seeing lots of play and is still in Standard, but it doesn't see nearly as much play in the non-standard formats. So in the long run, I do think Erza Saga will remain Magic's best saga. So those are the 10 best sagas in Magic. If you're interested in owning any of these cards, check out the description where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for each card that appeared in the video. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it. If you want to catch up on some past videos, you should see some playlists on your screen shortly. And if you want to make sure you stay aware of future videos, don't forget to subscribe. Thanks for watching.